we're kind of on the cusp of Fervo being somewhat of a household name, certainly one that my mother might know in the next 5 years. I want to ask my first question, which actually an investor of yours asked me to ask you this. I think she had some self-interest. So the first one is geothermal really going to transform the energy world? I'm assuming you're going to answer yes, so if you are.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yes.
I'll give maybe the unsatisfying answer that it's going to take a very, very long time.
Okay.
And you sort of think about this, look at energy technologies that are successful today. You've got, solar obviously is growing at a really rapid pace, and you look at where's most capacity additions coming from, and it's from solar. And solar is a technology that was, sort of commercialized, and solar PV was brought about in the 70s. In the late 2000s, you sort of crossed this intersection where it was getting cheap enough to work at utility scale. And it probably took until 3 to 5 years ago for it actually to show up as a big enough piece of the energy mix to have a dent in emissions. And here we are today in 2025, and it's a successful technology, but it's still got a long way to go until it makes a true global dent in emissions. And so this is sort of what you sign up for when you do a startup in the atoms world, not the bits world, is that you can make change, but it's a journey that you need to stick with for a while. So if I think about solar being a globally transformative technology now, where you can look at a chart of carbon emissions and the counterfactual of like, what would it have been without solar, or the US grid capacity, what would have been without solar, and it actually, like, you don't need a magnifying glass to see the difference. And it's now growing astronomically, so it's gonna make a huge impact. So if you compare where we are in the geothermal energy today and industry today, with enhanced geothermal systems, we just proved out the first pilot project in 2023. We're just building our first large utility scale project right now. And so I still think we're, in the equivalent of, let's say, 2007 of where solar was in that framework. So we have a multi-decade journey ahead of us. That's just the nature of energy technologies. And for me, I think when I think about how we know we made it, or how do you know where there's success, it's about global impact. Can we look at a chart of carbon emissions globally and say this slice that's lower is because we commercialized geothermal technology? And I don't think I'll say we've made it until you can have impact at that global scale.
Awesome.
The number one reason people passed on investing in Fervo when we started the company in 2018, and this was still true up until about 2023, was people are like, who's going to buy the power? The U.S. electricity grid is stagnating. There actually hasn't been growth in the U.S. electric grid. Natural gas is cheap. Solar is cheap. We don't need to grow. We just need to maintain the grid. And so we'll retire some plants. We'll replace them with some combination of natural gas and solar. And that's the power sector for the next rest of our lives. And so people passed on us constantly because there was just, why would there be power demand? Right. And I think this is one of the fun things about being in the energy sector too, is like you blink and the world changes. The idea that there's not going to be new incremental power demand right now, and now that we have all this load growth and then we're throwing AI on top of it, is just wild. So it's like, we spent 2 or 3 years ago so much executive time, team time, management time, investor time at Fervo, trying to answer this problem of like, who's going to buy the power? How do we convince folks that there's a need for more clean electricity and that it's a bankable thing to invest in? And now we don't think about that question at all.
One thing I discovered through a little bit of research on this is we've been doing it at utility scale longer than we have done solar. So what is it that's changed that's enabling you to have all of this success at the moment?
Yeah, so geothermal's been around for a long time. And the first power plant for geothermal came online over a century ago in Italy. But if you look at geothermal up until just a couple years ago when Fervo started developing our projects, nearly all of the projects are literally sitting like on top of volcanoes or mid-Atlantic ridges or just rifted areas. You're talking about places that are famous for their volcanoes, like Northern Italy, like New Zealand, like Iceland, like Kenya. And the narrative around geothermal was always nice if you have it, but it's not in a lot of places. And nice if you have it because it's 24/7, it's carbon free, it solves all these problems, it can do heat and power. Like, it's a very phenomenal energy resource, but to be economic, you needed steam that was really close to the surface and it had to have the ability to flow. And so part of the why now is a technology story, because when I started looking, I started my career in oil and gas, which I'm sure we'll talk about. I was a drilling engineer right when the shale revolution was taking off in the US. And by the way, to get on another sort of energy nerd history thing that took a long time, when I was in college, the U.S. was licensing the first ever LNG import facilities. And the narrative was that there was going to be such a shortfall of natural gas in the United States that we needed to build LNG facilities to import natural gas into the U.S. And I went to college at the University of Tulsa, right in the heart of Oklahoma. You could imagine what the biggest industry hiring from was. And so what happened from the time that I was like a freshman to a senior, what you saw was like salaries for petroleum engineers doubled. And it was just this like, what is going on? And what you realized is that folks had figured out that hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, better seismic data acquisition, this full suite of technologies was actually going to unlock a lot of resources in the US for oil and gas that we didn't think we had. So I started my career there in 2012. And you know, in the intervening years from like 2007, when the U.S. was forecasted to become the biggest natural gas importer in the world, to today, the U.S. is now the largest natural gas exporter in the world because they found so much gas, they reversed that trend, and a lot of it was due to technology. So a lot of the founding story of Fervo was me looking at, look, if there was a lot of gas here that people didn't think they could get economically, and then these new technologies came in and totally changed the story. You look at the analogy to geothermal, and I learned about geothermal because I was researching high temperature drilling when I was working on a drilling rig in South Texas. And there was a report called the MIT Future of Geothermal Energy that had been published in 2006. And it said, if you could just figure out how to do low cost drilling and get high flow rates out of low permeability wells, this resource could be anywhere and it could solve the climate problem. And I was like, whoa, we solved that. Like there's clearly an opening here. And so we had access when we founded Fervo in 2017 to drilling technology that was brand new, that had just had a huge breakthrough, and that we could apply systematically to the geothermal sector that shifted the cost curve and the eligibility of where it could work beyond these niche resources, beyond the place in northern Italy where it was literally like the local eccentric rich guy who'd gotten obsessed with steam turbines, and he had a geothermal vent in his backyard, and he was like, what if I just put a steam turbine on this? And you compare that to where we are today. We drill 10,000 feet down, 5,000 feet horizontally. We image the rock. It's in granite. We go down to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Huge change in complexity. So the technology was ready. And then the other thing, of course, is the market. What we got lucky in is from a timing standpoint, we founded the company, we went through the lab R&D, we went through the pilot demos, and we finished the commercial pilot, our partnership with Google, and it came online in 2023. And there's a lot about my story that you're going to find is just like, what lucky timing, and that's true of any successful startup. And right around the time that we're like about to publish the results that like we have a project that works, we invented a new way to do geothermal energy, it's putting power on the grid, ChatGPT 3 gets released. And everybody's servers start getting fried because everybody's using so much AI. And all of a sudden the theme is, wow, how are we going to get all this energy? And we're like, well, we have a technology we just proved that solves that problem. So the why now is a big part of the technology's finally ready. We figured out how to deploy it. And we're actually selling electricity into a market that desperately needs new electricity now. And that was not the case until very recently.
Fast forwarding to today, you've actually just finished, you just completed the Cape Station project, is that right?
Still in construction.
Still in construction. Nearing completion.
Nearing completion. Yeah.
And I just wonder, are there some parallels with the town you grew up in and then this new energy system you're bringing online, which is emission-free?
Yes, there's definitely parallels to that. And I'd say, so Cape Station, so people know, we finished our pilot project in 2023. That was our partnership with Google. Phenomenal from a technical demonstration standpoint, but it's just a 2-well system. It was enough to prove it works, but not enough to really achieve our goals of like making a dent and the carbon emission story and in the electricity reliability story and the affordability story. So obviously we have to scale up. So we're scaling up by going from 3 megawatts to 500 megawatts. So we're building a 500 megawatt project in Southwest Utah right now. The first phase of that, the first 100 megawatts, will come online next year. We've already made really fast progress there. We have 3 power plants in construction. We've drilled 25 new wells, and rapidly we're moving forward to this point of like scaling up this technology quite significantly. So that's the scope of the project. And it actually shares a lot of similarities to my hometown. The town we're closest to is Milford, Utah, and it's a phenomenal community. There's about 1,200 people that live there. And what we found is just a great place to go and work and put our business. So, and I think there's one of the lessons that I have on development and building real hardware projects in the real world that impact real people's lives is there's no shortcuts. And you think about why do we have a good relationship with that community? It's because we had folks from the Fervo team start attending town halls there 3 years before we broke ground on our project. and we told them what we were going to do, and we moved forward, and I can tell you a great sort of like data point for us. We got permits to drill our first set of wells in 2023. We had a great groundbreaking ceremony. We had the county commissioner. She came out and spoke, and she spoke a lot about how actually in the backdrop there'd actually been the biggest employer in town had decided the same year we announced our project that they were pulling out of town. And so there was this huge fear of this economic pullback and job loss in the area. And in 2023, the county commissioner came and she gave a talk about what she sees in Fervo as the hope for us hiring locally and bringing new jobs to the area. And so that was a huge catalyst for this because we knew we were coming into a small town that had an economic setback. But I thought it was great. We had the governor come, other stakeholders come, but every single time we do anything at Fervo, we always make sure the mayor, the city council, the schools are represented, which is a huge part of the community development. And you know, one of the other things I'd say about development that we were really excited about, you're doing a big project and permitting, there's almost always some form of public comment period in that project. And I think there's a lot of developers that take the stance of like, okay, just keep as quiet as possible about the project for as long as you can because you don't want negative comments in the public comment period. And one of my experiences of like seeing a big power plant come and get built in my hometown is I'm like, you're not gonna keep that a secret from people. And people are smart. And so we showed up, we talked about it, we engaged people, and we took a very different approach on the public comment period, where we actually contacted all of the local officials, county commission, environmental groups, mayor, and said, why don't you send a letter in the public comment period about telling them how excited you are about this project? So we got like 9 letters in the public comment period, and 8 of them were positive from local stakeholders that were like, this project's really important. The 9th one wasn't negative, by the way. It was just totally off topic, which you see in these public comment periods. And that was really exciting for us. And to this day, we have a really phenomenal relationship with the local community. We've prioritized hiring locally. That firm that pulled out and had to lay off a lot of their local workers, we've hired several people directly from that company now. We last year kicked off a partnership with a local university called Southern Utah University for a workforce development and geothermal training program.
And you're doing apprenticeships as well, is that right?
Yes, yeah, that's at the Southern University program. And I think that the lesson that I take away from this, and I do think that some of my background and upbringing really spoke to this, is that people are smart. You're not going to pull the wool over people's eyes. You need to go in, you need to tell them exactly what you're doing, and then you need to make sure you create space so that what you're doing benefits them as well. And if you do that from day one, you build a lot of trust in the community that allows projects to get done.
That's awesome. And I mean, it also speaks to one of the challenges that nuclear has, which is around talent, which is one that it seems that you don't have. Could you talk through a little bit about that as you start to scale? Are you going to be relying on some of these communities going forwards? What's the strategy for kind of involving them in your growth plan? Yes, I think that's a big part of our story too. And you think about my background, born in Houston, raised in Texas, went to college at the University of Tulsa, worked in the oil and gas industry. You know, I think that's a big part of the story as well, is I think that when we think about energy transition solutions, we really need to make sure that we're talking about the folks that are currently getting their livelihood from the existing energy system are taken care of and see opportunity in the new energy transition system. And our ability to do that with the oil and gas workforce. Myself, I worked in oil and gas before starting Fervo. We did a survey internally recently, and we found that 60% of Fervo's employees came from the oil and gas industry. And so using those skills, it's a twofold benefit for us. Number one, I think it's the right thing to do, because as we change how the world gets its energy, there needs to be a discussion around how the people that are currently keeping the energy system going are taken care of. And the second is it means we have a really skilled workforce that we can just tap into immediately, which means we don't have to deal with some of the workforce challenges of nuclear. And my quick story on this, I was recently on site for this kind of critical well workover period that we were working on, and meeting and chatting with some of the crew out there. And there was a guy who'd been working on site for like 3 or 4 days, and he was working on a rig that had come over from an oil and gas job. And I asked him, how do you like working in geothermal? Well, what's your impression so far? And he was like, what's geothermal? Perfect. And I was like, the site you're on right now.
And I just use that story to talk about how seamless actually the transition is from oil and gas to geothermal. This guy had been working on site for like, because you think about it, what's different is that the rocks 10,000 feet beneath you are different rocks, but everything else kind of shares a lot of similarity. And it just cracked me up. One, we're going to do a better job of orientation for that crew going forward. But just that idea that it's such a transferable skill set that it's no retraining. And there's other things we do need to do retraining for. But this skill set, the folks we're bringing over from a lot of the oil and gas community, it's a very seamless way to get them plugged in. And that makes us move faster and our ideas better too.
It's a huge opportunity, and you've got an active workforce there. You're also using, as you say, the same technology. How do you prevent the oil and gas players from eating your lunch, overtaking you? They've got a huge amount more capital. How do you prevent that from happening?
I mean, there's all sorts of answers to this. On the one hand, you look at the shortfall in how much electricity is needed just in the United States over the next few years, and then how much us, even our wildest ambitions, can fill. We're still not going to close that gap. And so there's room for others. And actually, I think a lot about, if you think about the Tesla mission, for example, it's, accelerating the world's transition to sustainable energy. And what's fascinating about Tesla is they said, we're going to do that one-fold because we're going to put electric vehicles out in the market. And the second thing we're going to do is we're going to prove it's economic to put electrical vehicles out in the market so all the incumbents can start doing it too to accelerate impact. And I think we're going to see a bit the same thing happen in geothermal. We are clearly on a path to building what I think is going to be, to get back to your first question, an energy company that transforms the entire global landscape. But there's a lot more room for others in the marketplace. And we feel pretty good about the first mover advantage and IP position we have. And so I think the more the merrier is kind of my answer. It's a huge problem. It needs to be solved. And if Fervo's ultimate impact is we build the generationally defining energy company, which I think we will, and also we create a path for incumbents to lean more into clean energy, then I think that's a double win.
There's been a lot of talk during Climate Week, but also before that, around how, particularly with changes, the West is really losing out to the East as it comes to deployment of technology for climate tech. There was an article recently in Bloomberg where a bunch of European VCs have gone over and just were kind of aghast, I think, at how mature the manufacturing landscape is. If we think about the types of technology that you're deploying and using, that's one that the West is miles ahead of the East in. Probably the only one, actually, that I can think of in the physical world. And so I just wonder, how do you view China?
Yeah.
Is this an area that you're looking to deploy? Do you think this is a chance for the West to kind of do something which they can then be envious of?
It's a good question.
Try and integrate?
We like the enduring position we have, and I can explain that a little bit. One thing that makes geothermal a little bit different than, let's say, solar or a battery installation is the percent of the project cost that's actually the on-site value add work is really high. I mean, basically what we do with geothermal is we put a hole in the ground, which kind of by definition, you've got to do it right there at that spot. And then what we do is take basic kind of steel and concrete and cement, and we could figure it all up in a way that we can produce energy from it. Of course, there's a turbine component of that, but most of what we're doing is work that's on site. And I think that's one of the things that prevents quite a different barrier and structure to a solar or storage project, where a lot of the capital that goes into the project is actual acquisition of the equipment itself, which, if it can be super low cost from an overseas supplier, creates an enduring advantage. And so I think there's something inherently about geothermal, just the nature of the work, that makes it a more domestic resource. The other thing I would say, when you start looking at where are hardware innovations that have come out in the last few years, last couple decades, that the U.S. has an enduring competitive advantage over the rest of the market, there's very few examples. And I think if you think about the growth of our economy, this bits and atoms dichotomy, a lot of the market value appreciation that the U.S. has accomplished over the last 10 to 20 years has been because of the bits companies that we have, like Meta and Google and Microsoft, are just so phenomenally better than the rest of the world. They create enormous amounts of market value. But whenever you start narrowing down to what are things that the U.S. is really good at from a manufacturing or hardware space that's sort of newer, the three sort of examples you can come up with are Tesla, which I mentioned before, which there is a question with how good a lot of the Chinese battery and EV companies are, like how enduring that's going to be. There's rocketry and SpaceX. And then the third one that I think is often overlooked is shale. Oil and gas drilling is so much more efficient in the United States than anywhere else in the world in a way that is enduring, and we have a very sophisticated supply chain that is light years. And China has done a lot of shale drilling. They cannot match the cost structure in the United States, which think about that for a second. This is a country and a market that for so many products has been able to just dominate because they're so much lower on the cost curve than the US or other Western manufacturers. And the attempts to do shale drilling in China have been structurally higher cost than the United States because there's such a deep bench of skilled workforce and interconnected supply chain for it here. So I actually am bullish on it, one, because of the nature of the work, but then the second reason I'm sort of bullish on it is because we're taking an extension of drilling technology and applying it to a new domain. This is one of the few areas where the US has built a multi-decade enduring cost advantage in a hardware sector in a way that's very difficult to replicate. And I think we should learn from that. And I think it's one of the reasons why we should be leaning into geothermal more, because it's an opportunity to, it's going to be very hard at this point in time to pull the center of gravity on solar panel manufacturing or battery manufacturing back to the United States. The center of gravity on geothermal excellence, it's a very nascent industry, but it's right here in the US. And with the right investments and the right speed, that can be that way forever.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. And I think we invest in a lot of physical sciences companies, and a lot of them struggle on the chasm to commercialization, which is a struggle that you really haven't, doesn't seem like you've had. Do you think that's partly due to the fact that there is such great experience here that you're able to leverage?
Yeah. Actually, this gives me a great opening for any other founder in the room. Anytime somebody says oh, you solved that problem, no struggle at all. So easy. What actually is going on is we barely survived and we were scrapping every step of the way. And then in hindsight, it looks really smooth. So I've got a lot of stories about that. But what I will say, sort of my thing that I realized on this was the most critical decision I think you're going to make as a hardware founder is how big to make the next one. Sort of by definition, as you're proving out a technology, you've got to go through lab scale to commercial scale and progress it through the TRL levels and get it to the right maturity. And then at some point you have to decide how big to make the next one. And I think we made two critical decisions at Fervo that one paid off handsomely and the second the jury's still out on. And the first one I would say is that when it came to the pilot project, we got some great advice early on from one of our advisors to say, what is new about your pilot, about your approach? And what we found that was new is the way we were completing the wells and the fact that we were drilling it horizontally and a few other things there, but it was mostly about the subsurface. And so he looked at our project model, we're going to build this demo plant, and half the CapEx was going into the power plant. And he was like, why are you spending half the CapEx to build something that's a 40-year-old technology that you're not improving on, by the way? You're just going to hire somebody in to turnkey to build it. And so we made a decision actually to, rather than build our own project, to go find a geothermal field that was underperforming, or we could drill our new wells at a segment of their field that didn't work with existing technology. And there was a pre-existing power plant, so we could just flow our brine into their power plant and get long-term proof and commercial data from that, but without having to build the power plant. So that's one of the things where we sized down the project a lot that helped us kind of scale to market. And so that's why we built this 3 megawatt project, and then sizing it down and eliminating the power plant part from the scope paid off handsomely for us. And then we got to the next step, and we actually did the totally opposite thing, which is that we were going to go from 3 megawatts to 30 megawatts. And depending on what investor advisor you talk to, the rule of you shouldn't do more of a 10x scale up, or some people will say a 2x scale up. It's different from every industry because there's just things that you're going to learn in the scale up process, and you shouldn't do more than 10x in one jump. And we could not get anything about that 30 megawatt project to work. We couldn't get, we didn't have the economies of scale to justify the transmission investment. We couldn't get customers interested in buying such a small quantum of power. We started taking our permitting spend and dividing it by 30 megawatts and was like, wow, that's a lot. And so there's all these subscale economic challenges of doing a 30 megawatt demo. And I got advice from one of our other board members who, this is the total opposite of advice from what I just said, which her phrase that she says, and I think it came from General Eisenhower maybe, which is that if you're facing a hard problem, if you make it bigger, sometimes it's easier to solve. And so she was like, well, if it's hard to pencil at 30, what if you made it 300? And what we started realizing was that like we think we could deal with the scale up, and then all of a sudden like the dollars on permitting were spread around more easily. Like a transmission infrastructure build out made sense and everything. And so it was a big leap, and we got comfortable with it because we've built a lot of modularity into our system so you can scale up quickly. But we would have never gotten that project off the ground, and we probably would have still been stuck if we stayed in the mindset of like, you can't break the rule of going 10x bigger. You have to do it exactly. You went 3, then do 30. And we said, no, we're going to go 100x bigger, and we're going to see how it goes. And I just give this advice to say, or just tell this story to say that our path from lab scale to commercialization, I think the most critical decision you're going to make in that process is how big of a jump do you want to make each time. And one time it paid off handsomely because we went way smaller, and then the next time it's paying off handsomely because we went way bigger. And that's why, you as the founder you just got to make some calls on stuff, because there's not a playbook on this. You got to look at the situation in front of you and tailor it to the needs you have.
Wow. What's your vision for Fervo in 2050? Where are you going to be?
Our goal is to be the biggest electricity company in the world.
Wow.
We've done the math on it. We actually think we can get there by
when are you going to get there?
20...
That was the answer to the first question.
2039 or so.
2039. Thank you so much for joining us. That has been truly insightful and a great time chatting to you. And thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.